Hello everybody. In this tutorial, we'll be taking a look at the new and improved sun and sky features that were introduced in Corona version 6. We'll be going over all of the improvements here, so expect to see everything. From the ability of the new and improved sun and sky models that enable you to easily create awesome dawn and dusk scenes, to talking about how tone mapping plays an important role in getting a more realistic sun and sky appearance. We'll also be exploring the differences in the colors produced by the improved sky model. And towards the end of the tutorial, we'll also talk about the workflow improvements that the new and improved sun and sky objects offer. Namely, how you can now have multiple procedural skies and suns in your LightMix setups. So, enough with the intro, let's start tutorializing. So, first up, let's talk about how the new and improved sun and sky models give you the ability to move the sun below the horizon line while still accurately simulating the sky's appearance. The main benefit? Well, you now have the ability to create really epic dawn and dusk scenes easily. Let's do a little comparison to better understand things here. On the left, you'll see the previous sun and sky implementation play out, and on the right, the new and improved one. Now, there are multiple differences here in terms of the two models, but let's just focus on what happens when the sun hits the horizon line. Now, if we stop the animation right about here somewhere, you'll be able to see how the sky behaves drastically different in the new and improved model. It'll actually look way more realistic as we get a lot more of that golden hour effect going on. But believe it or not, there is even more to it. If we try and really slow down this animation, frame by frame style, you'll be able to observe that the previous sky model doesn't really update as the sun starts to go below the horizon line. It just kind of stays the same. The new and improved model, however, well, as you can see, it'll still update even as the sun sets below the horizon. And this right here really allows you to do more proper dawn and dusk shots because now you get an extra ability to move the sun below the horizon line and have your sky update properly. Now, what is the magic behind all this awesomeness? Well, it's many things really. One thing is the improved sun model, which lets you move the sun below the horizon. You couldn't do that with the previous sun model. Then it's the algorithm behind the new and improved sky model that actually calculates the effects of the sun as it goes below the horizon, up to a certain point that is. And then there's also an improvement to the way the sun is displayed. But because of the horizon landscape in the shot, we can't quite see it in action here. It is pretty awesome though, and we'll talk about it in the tutorial. Right, so as cool as all that looks, you'd think the setup requires quite a bit of messing around. But hey, let me stop that thinking process right there. The setup is literally exactly the same as for the previous model. And so if you know how to place a Corona sky object and a Corona sun object in the scene, you already know how to use all these features. So let's open up Cinema 4D and let's showcase how simple the setup can be. Right, so the scene we'll be using here to demonstrate things is really straightforward. Just a sea mesh with a water material applied on it that has some bump maps so that it kind of looks more like, a sea would look like. And then there is also this reflective sphere here, which is a simple reflective material applied to it. So basically like this chrome-like material. Okay then, first off, let's talk about how to set up a scene from scratch and in a way so that it uses all the improvements we just showed. Spoiler alert, you just need to put in the Corona sun and sky objects in your scene and it'll all work by default. So let's start by putting in a Corona sky object in our scene. So I'm going to go under the Corona menu up here and I'm going to select the Corona sky. And then let's also bring in the Corona sun by going under that same menu and selecting Corona sun. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring over the interactive renderer just so that we can see the scene being rendered. And you know what? We can actually change the angle of our sun here to about 6 degrees or so, just so we can see the sun a little bit better here. And voila, you're now already all set up with all the cool improvements we listed before. And I wasn't lying. The setup, as you can see, is exactly the same as it used to be in the previous versions. In a fresh scene, all you need to do is bring in the Corona sun and Corona sky objects, and you are all set. Now, For all of you who want to update your existing scenes and want your existing sun and sky setups to use these improvements, well, you simply need to go into the Corona Sky object properties and make sure that the sky model is set to improved. If you are working on a scene that used the previous sky model, so basically your old scenes, chances are it was set to Hosek and Wilkie. So this is the previous model that was in use, and to use the new improved one, just simply change it to the improved model. And that's all there is to it. You are now rocking all the new visual improvements. Now, as for the sun, there really isn't anything to set here as the improvements are automatically active. So, if we bring the sun down towards the horizon a bit more by adjusting its angle parameter, well, you can immediately see that even if the sun is only 1 degree above the horizon, we are getting that nice golden hour effect going. Now, with the previous sky system, if you remember the comparisons from before, this wouldn't quite look as good. Now, let's make the sun a bit bigger here so that we can see it a bit better. So let's set the size of the sun to be about 8. Okay, cool. But as you can see, it's still not looking quite as you'd expect. It still kind of looks like a sun would look like at noon. And for it to behave more realistically, well, we just need to toggle the textured parameter to on here. Now, I don't know about you, but that looks darn cool. The improvements to the texture functionality of the sun are clearly visible here. Just check out this nice gradient of colors as the sun touches the horizon. And if we tweak the exposure just a little bit more from here to maybe -4, well, oh my, I'm a huge fan of this type of a look. Now, the textured option itself, if you have it enabled, it will automatically use the new improved model, which creates this nice gradient on the sun as it gets closer to the horizon. But do note, however, that as with the previous version, if you have it enabled, the rendering performance might suffer a tiny bit depending on the situation. That said, if your sun is visible to the camera or visible in the reflections, you'll obviously get a much more realistic result because of it. Okay then, besides the improved textured functionality, the Corona Sun object has another key improvement to it, and that is the ability to set the sun's angle to go below the horizon. So basically, you can set its angle to go below 0 here. And as you can see, we can now get that full twilight to night effect as we can literally move the sun down to a point where it'll no longer be visible. And this really gives you the ability to create some really fun dawn or evening shots that start or end with the sun being below the horizon. Now, do pay attention to the size of your sun for these effects because it does matter. So for example, my sun here is currently set to size 8, and so the cutoff mark for it to be completely below the horizon, as we've just seen, is at about -2 degrees in terms of its angle. Now if I were to set my sun to be of size 1, well then the sun would disappear at a different angle. So it would probably disappear at around -0.2 or -0.3 degrees, as we can see. And just so you know, the size setting, it doesn't affect the intensity of the sun, because for that we use the intensity parameter, obviously. What it also doesn't affect is the sky and how it is being calculated, because the sky itself will adapt only to the position of the sun. So if you observe the sky here, as I change my sun back to size 8, you can see that it stayed the same. And that is because the size parameter only controls the visible dimensions of the sun. Now, if we bring up the exposure a bit here, so we set it from -4 to -2.5, for example, yeah. And if I continue moving the sun even further below the horizon here, you'll be able to see that the sky will update to the movement of the sun even when the sun is completely below the horizon. So if I keep lowering the angle, even though the sun is below the horizon, you'll be able to see that the sky still updates. Now, why is that? Well, the improved sky model still simulates the effect of the sun on the atmosphere, even though it is a bit below the horizon already. And you'll get this effect going until the sun goes down below the horizon line for roughly 5.4 of its diameter in size, which is at the minus 2.85 angle mark. Now, do note one thing. When I say 5.4 of its diameter, I mean its actual simulated size. So not the size right here, which is essentially its display size. We're talking strictly about the size that is under the hood, which is the same as the default value of the size parameter here when it's set to 1. Right, so anything below the minus 2.85 degree mark and the sky nor the sun won't produce any visible updates. It'll look exactly like it does now. And so basically, that's just where the improved sky model algorithm stops calculating what is going on. That said, if at any point you wanted to completely kill the sun and sky contribution without disabling it in the object manager, you can simply set the sun's angle amount to minus 90 degrees, and that should produce a pitch black scene, as you can see right here. And so that's a bit of a quick tip for you out there. Okay, at this point, I'd like us to take a bit of a step back from focusing on the new improvements and talk about tone mapping for a minute. Tone mapping, believe it or not, is crucial in getting a good, realistic looking sun and sky setup. Just think about it. The sun itself is basically a super duper crazy bright light source, and the sky, well, it's really kind of like a constant light source that shines on your scene from every direction. And so if you think about it, if you don't tone map your images properly, you'll get a lot of weird blown out areas. Or the complete opposite, you'll see aliens sunbathing on the surface of the sun because your highlight compression is over 9,000, meaning it's super high, super strong. So to keep the babbling short, balancing your images, tone mapping wise, is crucial to getting really realistic looking suns and skies. In our example scene here, if you've had your Hawkeyes on, you've probably noticed I was using customized tone mapping settings this entire time. So I've got my contrast set to 3, and then I also have some filmic highlight control going on. And then even some filmic shadow adjustments. Heck, I even have a LUT going on here, which is the infamous Kim Amland's photographic LUT 01. And this one is really great because it changes some of the color values of the highlights, making them behave more like a DSLR camera would. Anyway, all of these combined sum up to create this hopefully pleasant but very realistic scene. Now, just for kicks, let's start reverting these settings back to defaults. So, exposure. Exposure needs to stay where it's at because otherwise we're not exposing for a dawn twilight time of day. So let's leave it as it is. Then, what's on default is contrast. So let's reset it by just right-clicking on the spinners here. And then let's do the same for the filmic highlights. So I'm going to right-click on the spinner here, and you can immediately see that because of the LUT that we're using, this is already starting to look a bit weird. I suppose you could counter the filmic highlight control by upping the highlight compression parameter here. And that does get us there. But again, let's focus on resetting all these. So I'm going to right-click on the highlight compression spinner here. Right. Now, let's also reset the filmic shadows. And last but not least, let's get that LUT out of here. Voila. It looks interesting. It looks somewhat close to realistic, but it isn't quite there. The highlights are just too strong, like really way too strong. And well, the image lost a lot of its contrast. So as you can see, tone mapping is crucial to get these things to look realistic. Even if you use a camera in real life, you'd probably need to make some adjustments for a shot like this. And one really important thing to understand at this point is that none of the settings are exactly universal because they depend on your scene. Don't believe me? Well, check this out. If we up the exposure here to say -2, and then we up the highlight compression just a little bit here, and then maybe we add some contrast in here, well, look at that. Even what is essentially a very quickly tone mapped image looks more realistic and more pleasant than it did before when things were blowing out, and so the colors were out of whack, and there was a lot less contrast. I mean, just look at how much better the sun looks like now. Right. So now imagine having a scene where there is no ocean, maybe there are mountains or meadows, and even imagine that the sun is positioned differently. And so for a scene like that, you'll probably want to tone map things completely differently. And don't forget, tone mapping is about mood setting as well. Different tone mapping settings will give you a different mood, so there is that to consider too. All in all, though, for the purpose of this tutorial, the message is that tone mapping has a profound effect on your images, especially when you have light sources such as the sun and sky here. Keep that in mind. And for all of you novice users, please remember that just copying tone mapping settings might not work optimally for you. These changes are quite artistic, and so it really depends on the style you're going for, the scene you're working on, and the vision you have for your project. Great. So with the tone mapping bit behind us, let's get back to talking about improvements to the sun and sky objects. One additional key improvement that pertains to the realism of the new improved sky model is the improvement to the color cast that the sky produces, as there is a lot less of that green tint coming through now. This change is actually visible at all times of the day, so noon, dawn, evening, and all in between. So because saying is one thing and showing is another, here's a bit of a comparison between the way things used to look like with the previous sky model and the new improved one. On the left, we have the previous sky model, and on the right, the improved one. And the difference, as you can see for yourself, is all things considered relatively noticeable, if YouTube compression isn't killing it, that is. The new improved sky model retains a lot of those natural warm tones in the image, while the previous sky model is a bit green tinted overall. Now, even less neutral colored parts of the image, like the flooring here, are quite noticeably less greenish with the new improved model. And before you ask, the tone mapping didn't change here at all. It's the same on both images. The only thing that changed was the sky model, which was set to Hosek and Wilkie for one image, which by the way is the previous sky model, and for the other image it was set to the new improved sky model. Now, if we zoom in on the mantle here, the difference is again quite noticeable. And if we right click and hold in the VFB and check the RGB values, well, on the right side with the improved sky model, we can see that the red channel is slightly more prevalent. But if we check the values on the left image here, which has the previous sky model enabled, well then the green channel is pretty much as strong as the red channel, which in itself isn't that bad, because if the blue channel here was just a little bit stronger, we'd essentially get a neutral white material. But then again, given that we do want to have a more realistic sun and sky setup, that wouldn't be quite as realistic. Now, granted, with either of the sky models, you can always go and try to change the tint using the tone mapping options or in post-production using curves or something similar. But the idea here is that out the gate with the improved sky model, you're getting an even more realistic image. And rest assured, the improved model doesn't only have this effect in interior scenes, it'll have the same effect, or even a more pronounced one, in exterior scenes. So here we have our sun at sort of a midday-ish position, and it's really nicely lighting up our scene. Now again, to spare us some time, I've already prepared the comparison images here, so let's just load them up as A and B. Okay, well, again, we are seeing that same difference between the two sky models. The new improved sky model, which is the right image here, really lessens that green tint and instead produces a bit more of those natural warm tones in the image. The difference is even more stark than in that interior scene we just looked at, and typically, from my experience at least, exterior shots tend to look quite a bit different because everything is so openly exposed to the sky itself. Now, if we zoom in on something a bit more white, like this curtain here, you can see that the difference really is very noticeable, as you just have less of that green tint in there. And you can even see this effect on the wood material right here. And so that is quite a big difference right there. Now don't forget one thing. With the new improved sky model, there will be less of that green tint at all times of the day. And just as before, the difference is quite noticeable, as you can clearly see in this comparison animation. Okay then, So hopefully so far you've seen that the Corona Sun and Sky have gotten quite a treatment in terms of how they look and how they behave. What we didn't showcase yet, however, are the workflow improvements when it comes to LightMix, because now you can have multiple Corona Suns and multiple procedural Corona Skies in your scenes and have them work nicely together when light mixing. Right, so if you are kind of new to things, you are probably wondering, procedural what now? But fear not, that only means we are referring to the physical sky type here, which basically means that we're using the simulated or procedural sky, like the new improved sky model, or the previous Hosek and Wilkie model, or even the raw fake model. And to be totally clear, in the past, you could have multiple Corona suns and multiple Corona skies in your scenes and light mix them, but for it to work, your Corona skies had to be set to be using HDRIs to light the scenes. If you've used the procedural setting in the past and you wanted to light mix it with multiple suns, well, that didn't work, as every sky was affected only by the first sun in your scene. And, well, it just wasn't working. Fortunately for you, though, with the new improvements to the sun and sky objects, that is no longer a problem. Now, we won't go into the details too much here because we'll cover things in more detail in a more specific LightMix oriented tutorial, but we'll still quickly showcase how things work. Okay, so as you can see, we have 3 Corona suns in here, and then we also have 3 matching Corona skies in here. And so the idea is that all of these skies are set to be procedural skies, so they are set to be physical skies, and they have the appropriate suns linked to them. Then we have all of these suns and skies neatly nested inside their own light select layers, so that we get them showing up in the VFB when we're using the LightMix menu here. Right, so what is the improvement here? Well, as you can see, if I go through the LightMix layers here where the skies are isolated, you can see that each sky is looking different because it's matching its sun correctly. And that just wasn't possible before unless you were using HDRIs instead of the physical / procedural skies. So now what this enables me to do, for example, is to bring up my dawn setup here. So I can take my dawn sun to be on and its corresponding sky too. And because we are not bats, we do need some artificial lighting in here, so let's turn on the ceiling lights, which reside in the rest unassigned layer. And cool, this is our dawn setup. Now, because of the improvements to the sun and sky objects and how they work, we can now actually say, you know what, the client also needs a noon shot, and so we can turn off the dawn setup here, including the ceiling lights because we do care about the environment. And then we can turn on our noon sun and our noon sky. And voila, we now have our noon set up. And this is all by using the procedural Corona sky and sun setups. We can even go from a noon setup to a dusk one, and it'll all work perfectly because the skies will all be properly matching their sun's positions. All right then, that just about wraps this tutorial up. As always, we hope you've learned a lot here, and perhaps equally important, we hope you've been at least a little bit inspired to go and experiment with all these new features yourself. The improvements really can be drastic, and as always, we've tried to make them as fun to experiment with as we thought was possible. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, take care.